This is now the fourth episode on the Rapture. We've already seen 5 reasons to conclude that the Rapture occurs before the tribulation. And now we're going to look at 3 more. So the 6th reason, evidence for a pre-tribulation rapture, is that the tribulation is conditional. Now this evidence for a pre-tribulation rapture requires a bit more explanation. So let me state it first and then explain. Jesus rebuked the church at Thyatira in Revelation chapter 2 for allowing a highly immoral false teacher to remain. In verse 22, he writes this, "Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds." Jesus says that he will thrust this false teacher and her followers into great tribulation, a phrase that is used for the last half of the entire 7 years of the tribulation, because it's when God's overt, active wrath is poured out in the judgments that we find described in chapters 6 through 19 of the book of Revelation. But they may escape if they repent of their error. If the whole church is going into the tribulation, as the post-tribulation position says, Jesus couldn't keep this promise. The last half of the tribulation, at least, is presented here as being conditioned on being unrepentant of known sin. If the rapture occurred after the tribulation, what Jesus says here would make no sense. This means that the rapture occurs before the tribulation and sorts out genuine believers from mere professors. Genuine believers will repent and be delivered from the great tribulation. It's important to remember that while Jesus' message to the 7 churches in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 were delivered to actual churches and dealt with specific historical realities of that time, they also have a universal and timeless application to the church in every age. That's clear in the repeated exhortation that we find in those chapters that he who has ears to hear, let him heed the message to the churches. The primary warning of Revelation chapter 2, verse 22 was to the church in Thyatira in the first century. What judgment Jesus cast the unrepentant into, we don't know. But for sure, it was something. His choice of the words great tribulation point to a larger, wider application of the warning beyond Thyatira and the first century. Now, a 7th reason, evidence for a pre-tribulation rapture, is that the time of one of Christ's coming is unknown. One of the most convincing proofs for the pre-tribulation rapture is that it's the only one that can account for the repeated reference to the coming of the Lord being at a time not expected. The 9th chapter of Daniel clearly spells out that there will be 1,260 days from the time the Antichrist enters the temple in Jerusalem and declares himself God until the return of Christ. And yet, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, it makes it clear that no one knows the day of Christ's coming. And the only way to reconcile this is to understand the rapture and the second coming as different events. I often see comments from people who link the rapture and the second coming. They make them the same thing, but they can't be, because if they occurred at the same time, Jesus could not say that no one knows the day of his return. There will be lots of people who can know it. Everyone alive during the tribulation can calculate the day of Jesus' second coming. It's going to be 1,260 days after the abomination of desolation is set up. The Jews of Jesus' day missed his first coming because they misinterpreted the prophecies regarding it. One set of prophecies foretold a suffering servant. Another set foretold a conquering king. Well, they regarded the suffering servant prophecies as symbolic of the hardships that Israel suffered, while the prophecies of a conquering king they took literally for the Messiah. And so they looked for him to come in majesty, and they missed his actual coming in humility. And we ought to learn from that. The second coming of Christ has 2 phases, as did the Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah. Before Jesus comes to earth in glory as the conquering king, he comes secretly in the clouds to receive his bride. This coming, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, is like a thief in the night, not a king in the midday sun. No one knows when Jesus will come in the rapture, which is very different from the second coming, which can be calculated as 1,260 days after the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist enters the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem and demands to be worshipped. Now, some object, and they say that when Jesus said that no one knew the day or the hour of his return, he only meant to the people that were hearing him back then, 2,000 years ago. If we limit Jesus' words to that audience about that, what else are we then obliged to limit his words to? Either Jesus' word is eternal or it isn't. As John said, there was much more that Jesus both did and said that wasn't written down. What was recorded, John said, was so that we might believe. Now, sure, Jesus said a lot of stuff to the disciples and others that never got recorded. Precisely because it was only for them. It was time-bound, limited. But that which is recorded in the Gospels is because it isn't time-bound and limited. When Jesus says, no one knows the day of his return, the return that he's referring to has to be the rapture and not the second coming, because the rapture is the only return of Christ that no one at any point in history can calculate by the word of prophecy. All right, last, the eighth reason why we can conclude a pre-tribulation rapture is that earth conditions are going to be very different for the rapture and the second coming. This, I believe, is another convincing proof for a pre-tribulation rapture. One of the things Bible readers note generally, while students of prophecy tend to focus on, is the two very different conditions of the earth when Christ returns in the rapture and the second coming. Some prophecies speak of Christ coming unexpectedly, at a time really when it's kind of business as usual. And yet other prophecies describe him coming when earth has been hammered by one cataclysm after another. It's certainly not a time that can be described as business as usual. For example, here's a business as usual passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Note the stark contrast between the you of believers and the they of unbelievers in this passage. Verse 1, but concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. Here's another business as usual passage. Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 through 44. Jesus told the disciples, verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. Watch, therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Now, these and other passages, they paint a picture of a coming of Christ at a time when it is, as I said, business as usual. People are carrying on with normal life, when suddenly the righteous are removed as judgment falls on those left behind. That contrasts with passages like the book of Revelation, where at the second coming, Jesus returns to an earth at a time of global chaos and upheaval. The only way to square these is to understand 2 different comings, the rapture before the tribulation, and the second coming at the conclusion of the tribulation.